All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 11th International Primatology Lecture, which is brought to you by the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology at Kyoto University. Many of you probably know us as part of the Primate Research Institute. The PRI was recently reorganized, so we are now affiliated with the successor to the PRI, which is the Center for the Evolutionary Origins of Human Behavior. And this lecture series brings distinguished guest speakers from around the globe who have spent their careers studying primates, or as is the case in today's lecture, studying people who study primates. Our aim is to reflect back on the historical development of the field of primatology and think about the way forward. More generally, how to become a good scientist. So I hope you enjoy that. And the lecture series, we still have the same team of dedicated staff running this series, and we very much hope to keep going. So I would appreciate your support. And today's lecture is being recorded, and it will be archived on the YouTube channel of SciCasp. So you will be able to watch it later as well. Just a couple quick requests. After the lecture, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A panel to ask questions to the speaker. Otherwise, if you have any technical questions to the host, you can use the chat board. Okay, so with that, I'd like to hand over the mic to Dr. Michael Huffman, who is the founder of this lecture series, and he will introduce today's guest speaker, Professor Pamela Asquith.
Thanks, Susumu. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. It is really a great pleasure to be able to have Pamela speak for us today. We go back many years. I think when Pamela first came over on an invitation from scientists here at the Primate Research Institute, I was just starting my graduate studies. So we overlap a lot when we were both getting acquainted with Japan, and it's been a long journey since. We've met many times in Canada as well, where Pamela is from. There's a strong tradition of primate studies in Canada, and a long history again with the Canadian primatologists also coming here to Japan, and the Japanese monkeys from Arashiyama going to the US. So there's a lot of strong links and interactions between Canada and the US and Japan for many years. So today's lecture is different from the ones we've had before. As Susumu mentioned earlier, most of the lectures have been about people studying primates, but Pamela has a very interesting approach, and her career, part of her career has been based on studying people who study primates, studying primatologists, with a good bit of that attention being directed towards Japanese primatology. And she has many long-term collaborations, long-term friendships with some of the pioneers and current experts in the field here in Japan. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Pamela has to share with us. I try and introduce something that each of the speakers has contributed to their work in the way of a book, to get students interested to learn more about that person's work. One piece that stands out for Pamela's accomplishments is a translation of Kinji Imanishi's book, Seibutsu no Sekai, translated into the world of living things. It was like the Bible for all of the graduate students when we were based in Kyoto in the Laboratory of Human Evolution Studies. Imanishi was a very central figure, although he was no longer at the university. His office was still there, and the desk that he sat at was still there, and graduate students would kind of rotate through, and they used that desk at one time. So his teachings, his thoughts, his work were very central to discussions in the seminars and things we had. But his book, Seibutsu no Sekai, The World of Living Things, was always a topic of seminars. A lot of people had difficulty reading through it. It was very, very dense and very technical and very philosophical at the same time. But Pamela and her colleagues did an excellent job of putting that into English. And I think it has had an impact on scholars around the world interested in the origins of primatology here in Japan. So without any further ado, I'll let Pamela tell the story herself. She's lived it, and we're looking forward to hearing about it. Pamela,
thank you.
All yours.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for people coming to listen. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to share this with some of you who have shared some of the journey with me, and to fill in quite a few blanks on how an intellectual journey from the 1970s has gone. So I will get the screen shared and the thing up here. And it's out. And we should be in business.
Your screen isn't up here yet.
Isn't it?
No.
Ah, isn't it? I did share it. Let me see. Okay. You don't have it at all?
Not yet.
I'm going to try share screen again.
Okay, it's something.
Coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we have your desktop. Yeah.
Slideshow.
There you
There
go.
you go.
Is that
Perfect.
it?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this is my journey into Japanese primate studies, which, as Mike mentioned, is one part of really a study of language in science, as well as what became a study of Japan itself. And I plan to start with beginnings. After the very beginnings, I'll follow the thread of the journey through these topics, which begin with undergraduate years in the 1970s. So my parents were born in England and married during World War II in North Africa, where they both served as medical staff in the RAF. And after a few post-war years back in England, they decided to emigrate to Canada. They had produced 2 children in England and then moved to Quebec, and where I was born. And then they continued on to set up a practice in Western Canada, in Alberta, for a few years. So the slide, which I think is about age 5, is my elder sister and brother. Myself, this bear is still somewhere around in a box, but it didn't end up convincing me to study bears in the future. However, he was a good friend. So my earliest memories are from Alberta days. And one thing I remember quite clearly is always wanting to go down some little road or path. It was a rural area that I didn't know where it went. I think I was deposited back to my parents on a number of occasions and had a few adventures along the way. But I learned, I think through through the years, a sense of perseverance from my parents, and also a still existing love of following a path that I don't know where it's going. So I would say from just a fairly unremarkable childhood, I learned perseverance and that it's exciting to go down unknown paths. So I went on to university, having always liked biology. I thought, well, I'd like to start studying about people. So I entered this combined degree in psychology and anthropology. Those early classes, of course, have about 500 students in the introductory classes, and nothing much sort of necessarily grabs you. But in my second year, something really stood out. And this was really the first intellectual mentor for me. And the professor was Gordon Reedman Lowther, who had moved to York University in 1970. He'd been trained in Cambridge, England, and worked for years as an archaeologist, but he also had a lot of other interests. And this too, I find a bit of a theme in my mentors. They're quite eclectic in their scholarship. So in Lowther's case, he actually taught in the three disciplines, the anthropology, philosophy, and biology. And he had, just prior to coming to York University, had a 3-year lectureship in Nairobi. And there he had met George Schaller. And he did an experiment, a field experiment with George Schaller. Schaller at the time was finishing his magnificent study on lion behavior in the Serengeti, at the Serenera research station. And one of Lowther's most notable papers was one he did with George Schaller that was called The Relevance of Carnivore Behavior to the Study of Early Hominids. Published in 1969 in the journal that later became called the Journal, now it's called the Journal of Anthropological Research. They, as an abstract from the journal, states, they thought that you could add to speculations about early hominid behavior, further to what people found from studies of non-human primates, by comparing with animals that procured food in a similar way, which was by cooperative hunting, and that lived in a rather similar environment, which could be forest fringe or savanna. So they did an experiment which is described in the more popular book by Schaller, Golden Shadows and Flying Hooves, published in 1973, where for a couple of weeks they went without weapons and without the use of language to see what they could gather as an early hominid. And so they counted something as caught if they could do, as Schaller's doing here, grabbing a zebra by the tail, or if they found they could scavenge sometimes, or they could get young animals, young gazelle that might just freeze when they came near. And they found they could get quite a bit of meat, actually. And the idea did meet with some sympathy. At the same time, as Schaller was doing his study, Hans Cook was studying another social carnivore. And Nico Tinbergen's foreword to that book also stressed that convergence was as important as comparison between closely allied species. So all of this comes of some relevance when we look later at the use of non-human primates in speculations about early hominid behavior. So Schaller, to our great delight, gave a guest lecture at York University. It's quite unforgettable, and completely head turning for me. You can imagine him standing there with his video and just talking about this magnificent area and the magnificent study. So I felt, wouldn't it be nice to do an ethological study of a social carnivore species? And as a second-year undergraduate, it needed to be restricted to somewhere near Toronto, where I was doing my other courses. And the solution was a safari park. I am not in this truck. That is a member of staff. I did my observations from a small car. And I used Schaller's work as a sort of a basis for comparison about the effects of very different environment on behavior. In other words, what was the range of behavioral plasticity one could see in lions. You could see that through the different seasons, there were a great many differences besides the climate and environment, the way the food was dispersed, the socioeconomic ratio, the rest of it. And what struck me, besides the differences that I had reported on for an undergraduate thesis, was how to describe all that was going on. Now, Schaller's book is an absolute model of wonderful, objective, and yet evocative description. But there was one episode that, again, turned the course of my study for me, and it was a play episode. So I've been observing the lions. In the end, it was on and off over a period of almost 2 years. And of course, I knew the individuals and could recognize individuals, and they all had somewhat different personalities and so on. But there was one day, there was a little shed that I could see from where I was parked, pretty much all the way around it. And 2 sub-adult males were playing a game. They were just playing. And one would be behind the shed, sort of hiding, and another would come sauntering by in front of the shed, and the other one would leap out and they would tussle, and then they would change positions. The other would go behind. And this went on a few times. And then finally, the one went behind the shed, and I could see the other one had just, that was enough, had given up, went off. The other one waited and waited and waited. And when he came out, he looked around, saw the other lion, and went up and absolutely clobbered him. And I thought, well, he was sort of ticked off or frustrated or so on. Anyway, it was that small thing that made me think there's so much more going on in these behaviors, in these lions' lives than you could discuss or put down in, in a serious report. So when I finished the BA, I had the opportunity to have a few months to see Schaller's lions in the Serengeti. And besides being struck by the extraordinary beauty of the surroundings, I thought how very vulnerable humans on a savanna were. So the early hominids, of course, they would be competing with the ancestors of the other social carnivores and not really have any built-in defenses with that way of life. So I applied from Africa to the University of Toronto to do a master's on anthropomorphism. I wanted to see, is there a way we could not necessarily justify anthropomorphism, but have a closer look as to how various aspects of description of other species worked or could be made to work and be made acceptable. I found on my return to Canada, basically, they said it had been lost in the mail. What I wanted to consider was that the terms we use to describe behavior matter because they limit description. The kinds of behavior that was focused on so much in those days of making comparisons with human behavior was that of aggression. Why are humans so aggressive? You may remember Robert Ardrey's territorial imperative got a great deal of press. Very often funding for animal behavior research came from the Department of Defense. I remember a lot of people writing their rationale for their studies. They usually contained an allusion to better understanding why humans were the way they were, particularly their aggressive behavior. So the limits to description matter. That is what terms we're allowed to use, since you don't study or report on things that you think animals aren't capable of. And there we have then anthropomorphism is ultimately what is considered unique to humans that is incorrectly applied to other animals. But you need to ask what is unique to humans. So the happy outcome of not going to U Toronto for a master's was instead going to the University of Oxford to start a doctorate in 1974. So this is the time that I turned to focus on primatology. So why was anthropomorphism important? Because our models and our speculations about the evolution of hominid social life and the biological basis of behavior were largely based on how we described non-human primates. The focus was on primatology because we were more likely to be anthropomorphic about our closest living relatives, I felt. And I must say, I'm speaking here from an anthropological, not a psychological perspective, because of course, psychologists have used many, many more species of animal models to discuss biological bases of human behavior. So my supervisors at Oxford were a philosopher of science, Ram Hare, again, a wonderfully eclectic scientist. He'd begun in chemistry. He did a great deal of work in psychology and in language studies, just quite an amazing and broad-ranging intellect. And someone who's no stranger to any of you, Vernon Reynolds, primatologist and then lecturer in biological and human sciences. And Hare and Reynolds had overlapping interests. This book, The Meaning of Primate Signals, in fact, was published in 1984, but they had met and begun discussing things back in the early 1970s. And when I arrived and was interviewed by Vernon as well to see about coming to Oxford, he had just returned from the Nagoya IPS in 1974 and from Fukushima, as it happens. So all of these stars were really aligning for this kind of study. The paper, out of interest, in fact, that Vernon had contributed to the IPS meetings was on the non-comparability of behavior categories in single species of primates. So he was already looking at problems of language in primate description. So my field site then became the interior of libraries. And the thesis gradually became divided into two parts as I read more and more of the primate literature. The literature written by Japanese and English was largely in the journal published out of Japan, Primates, although some papers, not many at that time, but some made it into Western-based journals. But the two parts of the thesis extended to, you could call, Oriental studies as the use and bases for anthropological language in Western and Japanese reports seem to be different. So I looked at concepts of definition and metaphor and so on for the ideas of the expanded meaning in ordinary language terminology in English reports. But in the Japanese reports, I just had this feeling there's something else going on. Bit of foreshadowing, one of the students I met there was a student in economic history, Heta Kawakatsu. And we talked about what we were studying. And of course, Kinji Imanishi was a founder of Japanese primatology. And he started talking about the general influence and importance of Kinji Imanishi. And I thought, that's odd coming from an economic historian. But there it was. Kawakatsu went on to teach at Waseda University and then became president of the Shizuoka University, Arts and Culture, and latterly the governor of Saitama Prefecture, but a great fan of Imanishi. The second turning point while at Oxford, Masao Kawai sent his book to Vernon as a courtesy, Nihon Zara no Setai, and he, nobody there read Japanese, except we fortunately had one student who was there for a year, a Japanese student, Yumiko Ishikawa. And I said, would you please just translate the table of contents, at least? And in that table of contents was mentioned the Kyokan-ho, or the empathetic method. And I thought, aha, there's some proof of something different happening with Japanese studies. So on the completion of the thesis, I thought it would be very nice to see how Japanese research was undertaken in situ. Also, in a sense, retrospectively thinking that happily there were no jobs open in Canada, so I couldn't go there anyway. So we wrote to Professor Sugiyama about the possibility of conducting observations, and permission was granted by the then director, Professor Masao Kawai. So a Mombusho scholarship from the Japanese government gave me the support, and I began to study there in 1981 in the fall. My research goals were to answer the question of why did Japanese research seem so different to Western research, in description of the behavior, the insights, methods, and goals. And the way one would tackle that was, I thought, to look at various sub-questions. Were there effects of institutional culture, such as the Primate Research Institute versus the Laboratory for Human Evolution Studies at Kyoto, or the people, primatologists at Tokyo of the time? Nishida Toshisada sensei was there then, or the Laboratory of Ethological Studies at Osaka. There were primatologists scattered in different universities and in different situations for study. I wanted to see were there effects of mentors in how people approached their work. Did it make a difference if they studied apes, monkeys, or prosimians? And was there a different attitude with regard to the human-animal continuum? Those were my why questions. And then how could we fully understand what the research goals were? So the initial plans under the Mombusho scholarship, they wanted you the first 6 months at a language school. I think Mike also went to that, Osaka Gaidai. And I was very fortunate to be able to have a homestay with the Murase family in Mino. They had a lovely little daughter as well as their son, and the Mino monkeys are famous for their boldness. And this is actually in their own backyard with a monkey on the son's head. And then the next 6 months were to be at PRI, and the next 6 months in Kyoto. But that final 6 months ended up becoming much longer, partly because as I came to understand the Japanese language better, I found you could do much better research. And so once the fellowship ran out, the Mombusho fellowship or scholarship, I started inheriting English language students. I think a lot of us got by with being able to take on arbaito or extra work, teaching English, which is what I did. So the Primate Research Institute, this is very nostalgic. The group I was with, the studies of ecology, were on the top floor. If you're Canadian, you call it the 5th floor. If you're European, I guess the 4th, because the ground floor is the 1st floor to me. And I really felt people were, in a sense, in silos. I almost never got off the elevator in any of the other floors. It was always up to the top floor and always over to where the field primatologists were working. I want to show some of these photos to show the interior of the PRI at that time, as well, of course, as some of the people, but just to show how different the institutions can even look or appear, and that I experienced. So Morty Sensei, of course, was there, Osawa Sensei, and you can see peeking out here, E.O. Wilson's sociobiology, which was very much taken up by people in Inuyama, but not in Kyoto at the time. Some of the grads and postdocs, there are many more, but it's nice to see them again. The Laboratory of Human Evolution Studies, I've put this up courtesy of Mike Huffman. I hadn't found any of my interior shots. See, it's not nearly as modern. This is the original building where indeed Imanishi had given lectures sitting on tatami mat, and then, as Mike's saying later, having a desk and so on. It's not here anymore. It's been replaced by a fine new building, but we were sometimes 4 to an office. This is where we could stop and get, tea or cook or whatever. This is Takeshi Furuichi-san, and we think this is Yasui-san, but not. Memory doesn't serve well. So I just want to say, as we go on, just to locate people, for those who may not know Japan. I, of course, was in the labs and had a desk in the labs, but I did go to many of the field sites and to other universities. Soon after arrival, even while I was at the language school. So the Japanese macaque exists right from the northern part of Honshu in Aomori Prefecture all the way down to the southern island of Yakushima, not on Hokkaido. And so the places, the homestay, Mino, is really a suburb of Osaka. Inuyama, where the Primate Research Institute is, was very near Nagoya. Nagoya is here. Jigokudani, the famous, snow monkeys, are up just behind that. Arashiyama is close to or overlooks Kyoto. Awajishima is in the inland sea off of Osaka. Takasakiyama is up off near Beppu in Kyushu. Toimasaki, the famous place where the study of wild horses led eventually, as it's said in the history of primatology, to the study of primates when they saw a troop of macaques going past while studying wild horses. And then, of course, Yakushima. So the challenges for someone just walking in and trying to do this: how do you study scientists? Everyone's an individual. They all have their own opinions, outlook, experience, and goals. And quite frankly, many might wonder what on earth is someone just plonked in here suddenly watching us for? And when can you say you have extrapolated something generalizable from all these different kinds of opinions and observations and experiences? Recently published by Nicholas Langlitz is something I was absolutely thrilled to see, because he came to Japan 30 years after me and interviewed some of the same people, but was certainly in the same environment. His study was a bit different. He was comparing in some ways, Japanese and Western approaches, but he was also comparing specifically laboratory and field work. And it is a very magnificent book. I highly recommend it. It's quite an extraordinary book in terms of his command of so many eclectic aspects. He's a philosopher, an anthropologist, and a very good field worker. So he identified two kinds of science observers, and he stated Amanda Rees was self-described as someone who's never seen a primate, but she has written about in science studies primate research. Langwitz himself did participant observation, but I would categorize myself in the third one because I have observed animals over many hours, developed ethograms, tried to describe them. And so in a sense, you already have something of an empathy with what field workers are doing. And I found that quite helpful. So my primate species, I did study primates after all, was Homo sapiens. And Yakushima was quite a special place in terms of it being one of the unprovisioned sites in Japan. I'll mention that a little more in a moment. Masayuki Nakamichi, who was with the Osaka Laboratory of Human Ethology under Itoigawa sensei, did his studies at Awajishima. And this is a nice sort of a protective goddess, a canon for this. This is a monkey she's holding, and this is like a memorial for the souls of monkeys that have died. Kunio Watanabe was working at Koshima, and the famous potato washing and seed mining, or picking up soybeans by waiting till water came and got the grains of sand off them, is work that's well known to the primatologists, and really work on primates in Japan really began at Koshima. So on Yakushima Island, which is a bigger showing of it below Kyushu, we had a temporary camp one August. And in terms, from my perspective, I would just see what people were doing. So here's David Sprague and Tamaki Marahashi just waiting for something to appear, because the unprovisioned monkeys in that environment are quite difficult to just go and rustle up. So the monkeys were called affectionately Yakuzaru, or Yaku monkeys. And here came one out of the road, and then the follow begins. And you can see, I think from this, it's quite challenging. It was rocky, mountainous, treed, also 1,000-year-old wonderful cedars, and lots of rushing water. So there's a lot of hard-won data by primatologists trying to identify individuals, follow troop movements, and so on. And that's just sort of a feeling of what it was like outside of the lab. A second major thing with regard to this comparative study was Jane Goodall's first visit to Japan. Itani Sensei invited Jane. She came in November of '82. They're at Arashiyama here, and here with Nishida-san and Itani. But Itani Sensei put together a meeting or a retreat at a small locale at Chi, which was near Kyoto in the mountains. And I've put verbatim from my notes how Itani Sensei introduced the meeting. So the meeting had the people, the Japanese primatologists who had studied chimpanzees at Mahali, and some weren't there. They were on field work, but others, I may not have the whole list, but Furuichi-san, Takasaki-san, Kawanaka-san, Nishida-san, among others were there. And if anyone wanted to look back at the meetings, the Anima magazine sent a reporter who stayed with us over 3 days and reported, and doubtless took a lot of photos and things on it. But in a gentle unfolding, like Itani Sensei had, he pointed out the background to this meeting. So while Jane had already taken Gombe, so to speak, because Itani did arrive there, and he was told it was taken, not by Jane, but by someone else apparently. So they began to look around Western Tanzania, and it took them a few years to settle on Mahali, which is about 100 kilometers from Gombe. But although it's relatively close, researchers had never gone to each other's sites, other than that initial one when Jane had first arrived. And so, as Itani said, there'd been 23 years of research at Gombe and 17 at Mahali. Lots of papers had come out in the 1970s. And he thought the time for comparison had come. And his next statement, I think, very much encapsulates part of the approach of Japanese to primatology at that time, and perhaps one could say today, that they don't consider much about individual behavior, but social dynamics and population changes. And in this case, speaking of chimps, they're gaining an overview of chimp population dynamics, chimpanzee society in a larger sense, the sense that Imanishi would have called a specia. And he thought comparison and cooperation may be possible. So this slide I'm putting up just to bring in one other factor about Japanese primate studies. And I thank Mike for identifying people that the faces were familiar. I couldn't remember their names. The people at the back, so Waihara-san and Kawanaka-san, and then Amani was visiting a student, a graduate student from Tanzania at the time. And then I suppose Tano Sensei and Terashima Sensei. So I'd seen their faces. I didn't know them as primatologists. And of course, Itani from the beginning was interested as well in people, in the pastoralists and the people. Whenever they did African expeditions, there were also studies going on of people, of hunter-gatherers. And I know whenever anybody, any of the field researchers in those days, coming back from their field research, they would say, oh, it took some time to get going again, this time that they'd returned, because all the people that they had developed a relationship with, say they were helping bring food to the camps or whatever was happening with them, the local villagers, they had changed, or they were no longer doing that work, and they had to build up the relationships again. So the primatologists all felt it was very important to know the locals, which is completely common now in international primatology, and is essential, as we know, for conservation and for ethnoprimatology and all the rest that's developed. But back at that time, it wasn't so common outside of Japan. So this is just to show what an eclectic group had worked under Itani Sensei, and he also started the Center for African Area Studies during the 1980s. So in 1984, I was leaving Japan, and there was an IPS in Nairobi. So just to put in a few more people that have been so helpful to me through the years, came to the meetings in Nairobi. Keiko Nakatsuka, Suehisa Kuroda, and then Mariko and her husband, Harawa Hasegawa. Mariko was also at the chimpanzee meeting with Jane Goodall. So I returned to Canada, began my university career, and then phase 2 started of my Japanese research. So I had met Kinji Imanishi back in 1982. We had held Shizen Gakkai, or nature study seminars, over a period of 2 years, to which a very, again, eclectic group of people contributed. And Imanishi Sensei was lecturing through those years in the 80s as well. I never heard him give the same lecture twice. So this is very much how everything appeared, with the chalkboard and everything in the 1980s as well. Imanishi, I think, and commentators on him, I think have done something of a disservice to him, because, and he himself, because what became foregrounded was what was called anti-Darwinism. It was actually an argument against, it was anti-selectionism on the part of Imanishi. And this is really how he became known. And, you know, there was a big Nature article series where, in fact, at that time, the response to the initial letter, it was in the letters section of Nature, by Beverly Halstead, a British geologist, about anti-Darwinism in Japan and how it reflected Japanese culture and so on and so on. There was a flurry of different sorts of replies to this, but from a group from the PRI, Sakura-san, Kudo-san, and et al., they said how they really were trying to distance themselves from this influence of Imanishi, and you know, had taken on modern views in sociobiology and so on. But in a sense, people were being forced to defend themselves. And so the idea to translate what was so basic to all this later work that Imanishi wrote about sort of came to the fore again. So this first edition, which was a wonderful gift from the Imanishi family, was published in 1941. And in 1987, so a good 10 years after Heita Kawakatsu had first mentioned the possibility of translating it, we happened to both be back in Oxford, overlapping on our own research projects for a few weeks, and we spent 3 weeks roughing out the first 3 chapters. In 1988, back at the University of Alberta, where I was teaching then, or I was a postdoc, an anthropologist, a visiting postdoc, Shisuke Yagi, agreed to help with chapters 4 and 5. And then Hiroyuki Takasaki, I can't say enough about his help through the years, not only on this translation. And he was the third person involved in the translation. In 1989, when what the Japanese co-translators had done was to read while I recorded the original Japanese in Japanese, which gave me the readings for the characters, which helps in looking them up because there are a lot of homonyms in Japanese. And then I transcribed a very rough English translation. And then Takasaki-san helped me enormously with checking against the original. Anyway, I worked on my part then for a number of years, looking at all the Japanese again, but having these bases against which to compare the original text. So the publication came out. I have to say there's been comment about why was it called the Japanese View of Nature. That was insisted upon by the publisher for the reason to market it. However, happily, it has been translated as well into German. The German version came out. We did have a lot of correspondence between each other as they were completing theirs. Asa Wutenau, and then Baptiste Lanespezas, the French version, and Bernardo Urbani in Venezuela did the Spanish version. Phase 3, I was back in Canada, 2001, a phone call, I believe it was from Takasaki-san, and he said he just heard that a lot of notes and papers, research papers, had been found by Kinji Imanishi's son, Bunataro Imanishi, and might be a good idea to get over there and have a look. So I went over and spent a couple of weeks. This is just a small portion of the work that they brought out. And again, I can't say enough thanks to Bunataro Imanishi and his wife Izuko, and to Kiyoaki Saito-san, who then worked for the Mainichi newspapers, and this is taken outside the newspaper office. But he had been a lifelong friend of the Imanishi family. He'd published so much on Kinji Imanishi and has always been present at so many meetings and efforts to do work on Imanishi. So 2002, I brought over a student, Peter Ryan. We didn't know what we would do with these papers. Were they just going to be cataloged and remain in Japan? Could they be digitized? We thought that would be best done in Japan, but we found it wasn't going to be easy there. So in 2003, Bunataro Imanishi gave permission for all the papers to come out. And Saito-san brought them by hand with his wife to Alberta. And we were in a room on the 14th floor of a building, part of the anthropology department. And that's where we worked on this. So we were cataloging it later that same year. After all the photographing that we took place during the summer with my help. These people did so much work. I took the papers back to Japan. So this is the kind of equipment we had. We were given exclusive use. The door was rekeyed to that room to keep the papers safe. Cleaning staff weren't allowed in or anything else. So everything was set up to take photos in this way. And the next year, the photoshopping to get the photos as close to the original color as possible was done. And then it was made into a website designed by Natasha Nunn. And that was up from 2004 to about 2016. So there are 8,000 images, his papers in that time span. And it's an absolute treasure trove and candy store, and I'll show you just a few images from it. The other wonderful store to understand Imanishi's intellectual journey is the Gifu Library Collection, where Imanishi's personal library was sent after he had been president of Gifu University in his later years. And you can see in these books all of his notes about the writers of the time, the ecologists and the anthropologists and so on. And he writes copious notes in the margin. He even corrects the English. I never heard him speak in English, but he corrects the English very well of the original English writers. So it's quite interesting. So we've always thought of the Toimasaki as so important to when Imanishi returned from Mongolia after the war, started where he had been studying horses and pastoralists, and started studying the horses at Toimasaki. So I thought I'd put part of the 1,200 page collection from this of the Toimasaki Uma. We tend to think that soon after, when the primates were seen, that they sort of stopped this study, but he didn't. And so these are just a few images. One of his publications is as late as 1951. So he did his first publication on Toimasaki in 1949, but continued. Copious field notes, or 1,200 pages of field notes. And I did this, brought it up to show what it would look like on the archive website. So you get good detail. And this was his paper back then. An important collection, what he abstracted from Western ecological literatures in different languages. These were the most challenging books to work on because they were just held with string, and we didn't want to damage it. So to open it flat enough was a bit difficult. So they run from 1935 to 45. And this is what a close-up of one of those looks. Another whole section are his individual notebooks with the kind of authors he was reading, Kropotkin. And again, you can see how if the author wrote in English, he wrote his notes in English. If they wrote in German, he wrote them in German. And then he highlighted what he thought was important. So you can do a good intellectual investigative report of how he came to his ideas. An important aspect of the work for primatology was the trip that he and Atani took in 1958 to meet people and to find sites for studies in Africa. So the groundwork for this was incredible. He identified people he wanted to meet. And you have Osman Hill and Bingham, Crawford, Yerkes, Zuckerman. You've seen in other places the photos of the people that he met in Africa. That's been shown quite a lot before. We have the receipts of the hotels. They're in March of 1958, Imanishi and Atani in Entebbe when they'd arrived there, 3 nights. Hotel Manchester, which is in fact in Paris, and even the kind of work, the effort made to practice how they would get along in English-speaking countries. The African field notebooks are a very large collection, and another thing again to reiterate that besides studying primates, you can see in the notebooks there's keen interest in how the people lived. And here, I guess he's looking at lineages within either a village. There's something like that in the area. And then all his notes about trying to get to the bottom of their lives, of their lifestyle, or the way their society was structured. 1970, another kind of insight, the colloquium on animal models for human behavior. And Imanishi is here, aged, I guess, 68 there. And his paper that he gave there was early conditioning and hierarchy in monkeys. So I want to move towards the end with saying what I learned from the primate studies. That Japanese had back then and continue today to spearhead international collaboration. And they've always had anthropology combined with primatology and multi-species research, which is so popular today in Western research. And Imanishi, with his broad intellect, I've found it quite interesting that graduate students have written, particularly about the fact that the archive is not online at present. The people who've written, and they are the people of the future, are studying, examining his work from these perspectives: religious studies, comparative literature, philosophy, and ecology. The archive I'm still trying to get back up online, and the problem is, of course, that the technology changes, the university database providers change, and many digital archives all over the world, there actually are conferences about this now, are suddenly, unexpectedly taken down. And most universities have too few IT people to manage the changes and the updating, and therefore things get put on hold for a very long time. So I just put that out there, that beware, always have backups. I fortunately do, and I do hope that this will come back up. And we can ask, is there any two-way system, two-system research? And I would say no, but we have national groups, and they all have their own historical questions and approaches. And they're defined by their pioneers and their foundational questions. I like the term foundational questions, which I first heard Anne Pusey use in the recent IPS SLAP meetings in Quito, where she was reflecting on 60 years of research at Gombe. And the foundational questions still, I think, impel existing work, and they can be revisited to find new paths. So the lessons learned in terms of just research and a life's journey, some of these, to my surprise, I found to be common to all of the other speakers. Serendipity. If a door doesn't open easily, it can give a lot of other opportunities. Definitely work because you're passionate about the research, not just for a particular degree, and not because the research is fashionable. It'll see you through a lot if you are interested in it. And depth leads to breadth in any field, but you can start with breadth to find the connection, and do make time to read outside your field. Collaboration's rewarding. Not all research is by its nature collaborative, but if you can find areas, it's very worthwhile. And do give back. Many people you'll never know have contributed their time, thought, and funds to your success. So thank you very much to all of these people and many more, and to you, my audience this evening. Stop the share.
Okay,
Pamela.
thank you for the wonderful lecture, Dr. Asquith. So we can spend 5 minutes or so for Q&A, I think. And let's see, those of you who are in the attendees room, please use the Q&A panel to ask questions. And the rest of you who are panelists, mostly graduate students, feel free to raise your hand, and you can use your microphone and turn on the camera to ask a question to the speaker.
While we're waiting, let me ask you a quick question, Pamela. When you started studying the lions and you had that observation of the lions, one hiding behind the shed and changing roles and everything, that perception about what may be going on in their head, or that more is going on than what you were reading in journals and things prior to that, do you think that had any part in your attraction and long interactions with scientists in Japan? That seems to be a very...
That's completely the starting point. Yes, because the reading, particularly the journal Primates, and often, which was the Japanese-based journal, speaking about research in Japan. I remember reading Itani Sensei's description of a change in the alpha monkey at Takasakiyama, for instance, and how the fortunes of the troop changed according to the personality of the leader. What sort of leadership was there? And that just wasn't, that kind of thing was not written about in the earlier days in the West. People might have thought about it, but there was so much more breadth in the Japanese reports that they weren't shy about stating these things that we thought, well, you can't really state them very objectively, or you're applying all sorts of mental capacities that we can't prove in animals and so on. And we've come quite a long way from that, but at the time, very ironically, whereas the Primate Research Institute people were really wanting to embrace sociobiology. In fact, sociobiology could be very well tested just because Japanese had individually identified animals, kept their lineages. They could, they could do the kinds of things that any Western primatologist might give his eye teeth for to have that kind of data. So it was quite ironical. Yes, but definitely that you were allowed to perceive animals, I felt, approaching in the way the Japanese did. And I'd first hoped to, having seen lions do what they did. Yes.
Yeah. Hmm. So did you become a lion when you were studying doing your undergraduate work? I know that was a big thing here in Japan. Professor Itani always told us to become the monkey.
No, but I did actually take a lion. You'd never be allowed to do this today, to the university to give a guest lecture. I was still an undergraduate. Some of the cubs would be rejected by their mothers and hand reared. And I took one that was probably about 6 months old, so getting the size of a very, very large dog. And I drove it the 2 hours back to Toronto on a busy highway, a lion with a dog collar on the back seat of the car, and took it into the university. People left the elevator on early floors as we went up. And I don't know how many bylaws were broken that day, but fortunately no police stopped, and I'd been, it had been suggested I could do this as a prop for the lecture. And then actually the lion had lunch with the president of the university in his seminar room, and upset the trolley of drinks and got into the houseplants there. And so they sort of thought it might be time to leave. And I drove the lion back. I mean, I didn't become a lion, but I had the company of a lion.
Thanks. I see Linda has her hand up. Do you want to put your mic and camera on, Linda? And I'll let Susumu handle all of this.
I don't know about my camera. Unmute.
We can hear you. You're unmuted. That's good. You're muted again.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say, Pam, I really enjoyed your talk. I knew bits and pieces of it, but it was lovely to see it all put together like that. And,
Thank you.
Yeah, and the question that came up in my mind is, as you know, from a conference that you and I attended together in Brazil, where there were scientists, primatologists, and the people who study scientists, there can be, at least in a lot of Western science, there can be some hostility towards the people who want to study scientists. And I know you can't generalize about all Japanese, but since they had a different perception of what they were doing and of the animals they were studying, what do you think their perception was of you? They're studying.
I think I can say, first of all, people were unfailingly kind, and from my perspective, pretty helpful. I think many were probably just bemused. Like someone just arrives and they're plonked in, and suddenly you have to make room in the office for someone else who at the beginning didn't even speak Japanese, just sort of coming to the meetings and things. And I actually found as I went along that more and more people would talk. I would ask specific questions and they would answer them. I would say, is the most important thing, for instance, an individual's survival in a group? And the response was no. So, you know, with evolutionary theory and so on, and that was quite different from what a Westerner would have been saying. And some of those kinds of interviews or conversations I did include verbatim in some reports, just so other people could see for themselves what was being said. The other thing, it's anyone who has studied in Japan, or Japanese people, social anthropologists in particular, all know that a great deal of information is gathered after you leave the office and go out for evening drinks or on sort of group outings that are done with more frequency in Japan, perhaps, than in our universities. And so there you could just be talking and not always interviewing, but people would be discussing their work. And so I didn't ever feel hostility. No.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I had a different question too about the Imanishi papers. Are they back somewhere, like in a library, being preserved?
Well, they were returned to the Imanishi home. And the last time I asked, I think Kyoaki Saito-san, he wasn't sure. Hopefully he didn't think they were kept in the same order necessarily as we had carefully kept them, which was the original order they had been brought. So depending upon what's happening at the home, we don't know. Oddly, no libraries were taking all the papers. They've run out of space. And of course, the beauty of a digital archive is that without handling the original papers, people can see it. Yeah. And so, yes, the short answer is I imagine they would still be in the home, but there may be changes there, in which case, since all of his own personal library of books is at Gifu University, they dedicated one room of their library there to Imanishi's works and one other person's works. So possibly there'd be space, or of course, Kyoto University itself. In the Kyoto University Museum in Kyoto itself, at Hyakuman-ben, there are boxes and boxes of notes and papers from the Kyoto University expeditions, some of which were first led by Imanishi, but by many other people too. Just sitting there waiting to be read. It's a candy store. It's incredible.
Well, but I hope you can also get your digital archives back up again.
Yes.
Find someone to put it up in a cloud for you, something like that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I need some IT people who I have all the specs on what it originally was, how it was originally set up. And we have the original web maker as well back at the University of Alberta. So COVID has, as you know, many people weren't even allowed to go to their offices for nearly 2 years, right? So it's put a little cramp in things, but going forward, I hope so. And anyone listening who, if they care to tackle, I am there to help, but not with the IT part, but certainly there to help. I have all the tips and everything else. Yeah.
It's great to hear that story again. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Linda.
There's a question on the Q&A panel, which, let's see, I can read it for everyone who's in the attendee space. From Kasha, let's see, thank you so much for your time and wonderful talk. And okay, so her question is, by considering culture of scientists in how they perceive animal behavior, is there a way of breaching the discussion on admitting that there is human bias in science? Should human bias in science be talked about, or should the practice of science continue to be viewed as neutral?
Thank you. It's always an important question. I think people have recognized that science is not done in a vacuum. A lot of effort was put in so-called postmodernism to show how there were a lot of biases in what people stated about what was, quotes, objectively out there, because in the first place, anything we're observing through our training, our interest. So different people can look at the same thing and see different things. Of course, people in science need to test the hypotheses. And if there's replication, similar results, of course, we come up with things we can work with and further our knowledge. But sitting here and now, I would say that there is not an objective science, I don't think, but there is very effective science, very effective work done, and we get results. Scientists get results, but it's always good to realize you can look at the same thing in different ways, and that can be a very powerful pusher of even better science and new discoveries.
All right. So kind of related, and this is my, I guess, open-ended question, but in the preface to the World of Living Things, 生物の世界 by Kinji Imanishi, he talks about how he was compelled to write this book because of the Second World War was approaching, so it's interesting to think about the effect of world's affairs on science in that sense. And yes, do you have any thoughts on that?
In terms of how world affairs are kind of science? Well, I think sometimes the funding for science can be very much directed by political will. So as I mentioned, a lot of the early funding for primatological research, or research that's looking to see what makes humans the way they are, did come from a Department of Defense. They I suppose if people are needing to find some alternative to production of energy, all the debate about should there be nuclear energy or not, with all its pluses and its negatives and so on. I should think if certain things occur in the world, there'll be an Ursula Franklin type response again, that you absolutely shouldn't have nuclear energy for, to power cities and countries. But there again, when other things are happening that make it seem like a good energy force, there'll be funds there for that science to be furthered. So yes, I think probably the people who decide what's going to be studied, I mean, individuals do come up with ideas, but they also have to be able to find a place to work, have to fit into that place. And if you're working in a lab situation, you're often doing the work that the head of the lab wants. You're part of that, particularly as a graduate student. Then depending upon that, the lab leader's own interests influences what's going on, in the world, depending on their own knowledge of events or how they're affected themselves by it, could potentially affect things. But I do think in a general sense, funding can be very much affected by what governments and certainly universities are, they're civil servants, right? People are civil servants, they're government workers. We think we're independent, but we're actually government workers. So we can be, yes, affected by world events, certainly. I think so. Often we're not aware of it, but certainly possible.
It's interesting that you cited Ann Pusey's phrase, foundational questions. I hadn't thought of it in that way until you started talking just now, but the early focus in primatology on dominance and aggression and male role within society and everything was very much perhaps influenced by military funding, because they had their question and people were responding to that question. So they had their framework for what their studies were, what they were writing anyway, based on a question from the military.
Yes.
Imagine if it had been started with a different foundational question.
Exactly. Yeah. But recognize.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say recognizing and identifying a foundational question, we can notice that was a trajectory, and yes, as you said, imagine another foundational question and then proceed with it. Make a new foundational question.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, any more questions for Dr. Asquith from the audience? Well, if not, what we can do is, well, I'm going to stop recording here, and then let's see.